Welcome to the 14 Winds podcast, where we talk about UFOs and all the related high strangeness. I go by Bones, and with us, as always, is Ram X.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Ram. So this is the exciting conclusion to our Nazi occult series. Right away, there's so much to talk about. How do we start? Or maybe better question is, where did we leave off?
So it's so big, and we didn't get into a bunch of stuff in World War II that we're going to have to talk about because it unfolded afterwards. But if you haven't listened to the first two episodes, highly recommend you go back and listen to those. So when we left off, the Reich was in ruins, Berlin was burning, and the SS, which was once cloaked in rituals and racial mysticism, were basically dismantled. Himmler is dead by suicide. Hitler is dead by suicide, most likely. And we talked about how Himmler was really the theological driver of the occult behind Nazism in the last episode. And we talked about how occult or esoteric Nazism was a subgroup within the larger Nazi party. So there were people who identified as Christian somehow and were still genocidal. I don't know how they squared that circle, but there was that in Germany at the time, as historians like to point out, and there was even that in the SS. These ideas got into everything, right? The same way mystical ideas will penetrate Christianity or different religions today.
Right. And I know we discussed, how the mysticism that Himmler was really into, how that kind of the power dynamic shifted. So, Hitler didn't like the fact that later on didn't like the fact that the mysticism was still kind of hanging on there because it kind of threatened his own power.
Exactly. Yeah. So Hitler was really more into the functional aspects of the esoteric, whereas Himmler was a true believer.
Right.
Hess was also a true believer, but Himmler more important to the continuing story, because one thing we didn't get into was that Himmler started this Project H. And Project H goes out in Germany at the time, undercover, into different academic groups and into different academic institutions. And they also go across Europe. And they're going out and they're collecting tens of thousands of pages of these documents related to witch trials, related to witchcraft, related to witches being burned. And Himmler has this idea that all of these witches must be German because he believed in this idea of a psychic Superman and a psychic Aryan race. Right. And so his idea was, if they had psychic powers or witchcraft powers, they must be German and Aryan. And here we are again finding this imaginary history that he was creating.
Right.
There's a bunch of things here. And Project H really stood for Project Hexen, aka witchcraft. So those tens of thousands of pages are in a Nazi castle that falls under Russian control at the end of World War II. So those tens of thousands of pages of humans under extreme circumstances and occult-like circumstances, and possibly what worked and what didn't work. Even though Himmler sold in this idea with a eugenic spin, where he said, the witches were all German, and then the people putting them to death were all Hebrews or Jewish, aka Christians too. And so he was aiming, sideways at Christianity, but he knew they were politicians. Himmler and Hitler were politicians.
For sure.
Right? They weren't tough guys. That was very clear. Hitler did serve in World War I, but in World War II, they were way in the back, right? These guys were politicians. So the way he sold in witchcraft was to also give it this eugenic spin. But they collected all of this data. And then we know that they were also engaged in all of these astrological experiments, all these dowsing experiments, and everything that went out in Wewelsburg Castle. And that was what the Ahnenerbe was also doing. Well, they were going out to Tibet and engaging in these meditation rituals. They were looking for Thor's hammer. They were looking for the Holy Grail. And all sorts of mystical things and trying to tie them together. All of that stuff either gets destroyed, looted, or placed into the Russians or the Americans' hands at the end of the war.
Right.
And the Project Hexen stuff fell into Russian hands at the end of the war. The Soviets clearly didn't just shelve that astrological research. And by the way, the Soviets have a long history of occultism in their own country, like Rasputin, for example.
Ah, of course. Yeah.
And so, but Soviets didn't just shelve that Project Hexen stuff. They started studying it. And they started to show a lot of advancements into research in the occult or psychic warfare that was starting to really scare the U.S. at the time.
Okay.
And that was going on in the 50s and 60s. So what do you think the U.S. did in response?
Well, of course, I mean, you got the Project Paperclip, where they actually had groups of German scientists basically help them research. I think rocket science would probably be the number one reason why they had those scientists. Yeah, they knew the Nazis had kind of a link into something. They were just technologically more advanced, and they wanted to know why, and they were worried that the Soviet Union was going to improve much faster than the U.S. technologically.
Yeah, imagine being the CIA and having all of those secrets and thinking there's some guy in a room in Russia that can just pop into that room psychically at any time and look at what you're saying.
Just remotely spy, right?
And that's a good reason why a lot of people believe that remote viewing has been kept sort of suppressed. We talked about the reality of remote viewing in several episodes and how everyone can do it and how there's very good evidence that it works. And there's good research into how to do it well and how to optimize it more. A good theory. So there's a good theory going around that basically says the reason that it's been suppressed by the government, CIA, and academia is for that reason.
Right.
The CIA and powers that be don't want anyone just poking their nose into whatever it is they're doing.
Right. So yeah, I mean, just the term remote viewing, I think it came out in the early 70s. There was that documentary called Third Eye Spies, where they talk about Russell Targ, who was a physicist and I guess a parapsychologist as well. And the CIA was real interested in his work. And that I think pretty sure he coined the phrase remote viewing. And so the CIA got really interested in his work. The timeline is strange though, because then we talk about Stargate, and that's when the official program began. And I believe that was a military army intelligence program that started in 1978. So there's a little gap there. But I think when you have someone like Targ, who was a physicist, who was a practicing physicist, looking into it and showing some results, it started to open some eyes, and then the government's like, okay, we need to pump up some funding and get this rolling.
Right. And Stargate runs for a long time. It's not like they just, right? It's not like they just took a couple years and said, no, it's just psychic nonsense.
Right. I mean, it's almost 20 years of not finding anything. I doubt it.
And even when they discontinued Stargate program, which is under the Bush Jr. years, and a lot of that is said to have been because of religious reasons. So the Bush Jr. administration was notoriously religious.
Right. Huh.
Yeah, a lot of that was said to have been for religious reasons, but at the same time, it never stopped. So we have good evidence to say that even though the public-facing program shut down, and they said it was because they couldn't rely on the intelligence 100% of the time, and that's a bold-faced lie. So Targ talks about that in that Third Eye Spies documentary, all the times that remote viewers have found stuff. And we've heard from a number of sources on that.
Yeah. And just, to follow the timeline to today, we end up with Jake Barber, right? Where he just recently described how they got a whole method of remote viewing where they're putting people in isolation
Yeah, I could definitely see some Jake Barber parallels here, for sure. And we'll talk about those in the next episode. I think you wanted to cover current events, and we haven't done that in a while.
Yeah. But I think it's just, when you're looking at the timeline, I don't think it's ever stopped, this research.
Exactly. Yeah. And those practices that we saw Barber doing in the desert were basically gateway process research. So that starts in the late 60s and 70s as well. And the CIA studies gateway process. And there's a paper that we have on our website, we've talked about before, that the CIA does. It says, yes, the gateway process is real. If you can astral project, if you will, into another space of consciousness. And within that space, sometimes you can see this world, or sometimes even the future or the past in this world.
Yeah. One of the biggest contrasts, though, that I always think about is that if the Nazis were playing around with this remote viewing, with the idea in their minds that this Aryan race theory, that they had special abilities, right? And I wonder if that played in. Did that give them more results?
Exactly. Great segue, because we're going to talk about Hans Kammler, or Kammler, who was in charge of all of the advanced tech and the stuff we set up in the last time, talking about that Der Riese complex in Poland. So a lot of their advanced tech, and a lot of probably the mystical stuff too. There's a lot of talk about what happened in that complex, but the problem is that it's really confined to a couple of SS officers who make the claims. So Kammler runs this Der Riese program in Poland, and he's also running the concentration camps, and he's running a lot of stuff in the SS. He wasn't just any officer. By 1945, he was in charge of almost every major Nazi superweapon program. The V2, aircraft development, secret underground facilities, and everything exotic. And there was a program that he was running, which was like the Kammlerstab, and it's kind of a predecessor to DARPA is today. Everyone, including the Russians and the Americans, all wanted to get at the information from this Kammlerstab, because what they were doing was what, to some extent, DARPA is supposedly doing today, which is saying, well, what if dogma wasn't real?
Okay.
So the Nazis were taking some of these ideas and saying, well, what if the occult was real? What if quantum physics was real? They were dealing with field effects. So we know that the phenomenon is related to a lot of field effects. There are a lot of, like the 1.6 gigahertz at Skinwalker Ranch. We just published an article called Condon Revisited, which I would really encourage everyone to read, which talks about the formation of plasmoids and how field effects are related to that, and what a non-kinetic phenomenon is, and it's related to a different field. The field that we're on is one world or reality, and then the field that these UAP are on are basically another. That they understood that.
Okay.
That could unlock a ton of stuff, right?
Right.
Apparently, based on reports, they were able to build what would be considered a ARV, which is alien or anomalous reproduction vehicle, or RV, or reproduction vehicle. I would definitely prefer the term anomalous reproduction vehicle to alien reproduction vehicle. Supposedly, they were able to build one of these ARVs, and it was called Die Glocke, which is the bell, right?
Yep. We mentioned, I think we touched on that on the last episode.
Yeah, we touched on that in the last episode. I think Dr. Bruce mentioned it in our episode with him. Was a bell-shaped object. It does resemble the craft of the Kecksburg incident, which supposedly crashed in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
And that relationship seems like it would be more than coincidence. Whether the Nazis patterned the Die Glocke off of a anomalous object like that, or whether this was an American version of that object. There's a researcher who's dug into this extensively. His work is worth looking at, is Dr. Joseph Farrell. And he's done a lot of work in this. He talked to some of the SS people who made some of these claims as well. But a lot of those are claims, and it comes from post-war testimony by SS officers. who I wouldn't initially give a bunch of credibility to, right? I mean,
Right.
we're both German,
Yeah, I
by
mean-
the way.
Yeah, we do have German in us. Yep.
Just in case
No
anyone
shame.
thinks we're being like, we're picking on the Germans. It's like, hey, we're
Right.
Germans. It's like, oh.
Yeah,
was-
and even with the that Project Paperclip, you always, when you read about Project Paperclip, the ethical side to that project always comes up too, because they were picking the brains of these former Nazis.
That's right. Yeah, and it's almost its own thing. Project Paperclip. Just real briefly, what Project Paperclip is: when they took these Nazi scientists who should have been under trial and should have been tried for their crimes and punished, and then instead the U.S. took them in and made them part of things like the rocket program. So we've talked about Werner von Braun, who's probably the most famous one, and he gets caught up in a lot of ufology too. So that's Project Paperclip. And that is really where the scientists, we would assume, from the Kammler go too. So that means the UAP stuff went there too.
Right. Yep.
So we're tracking, the way I see it, 3 threads here post World War II. And I think we can start to even wrap them up here. And it's number 1, which is the occult. So what happens to that afterwards? The Ariosophy portion. I think there was a question maybe that we started with the beginning was this a specific occult thread that wound its way into the Nazi party and then wound its way out and is still working its way to today? Not a specific one, I don't think, right? Ariosophy basically dies out to the extent that the Nazi party does. It's even a smaller subset. It exists today, and we all should be mindful in meme form. And that's basically when they're trying to whitewash or romanticize things. There's one myth we should dispel, and that's Admiral Byrd's diary and some of the Hollow Earth stuff from Antarctica that allegedly happened after World War II. Well, that didn't happen. So we pointed this out, and there's sources on our 14 Phenomena article in World War II. So
that was the American explorer that went to Antarctica.
Correct. Yeah, Admiral Byrd led an expedition, a military expedition. And I do think that there is something weird about that. We've never actually heard the real reasons behind it. Some of the people on board of the ship did say that they maybe saw UAP, but that's not that weird. There are naval vessels today, right, seeing UAP too. So, but as far as them going out there and finding a Nazi base in Antarctica, that was complete bull. And we even point to some of the verbiage that was in the supposed Admiral Byrd's diary that they said, discovered the Hollow Earth, and then how Admiral Byrd really wrote, and there couldn't be more night and day difference. It's like, oh, we're flying over the target at 0700 hours, conditions are clear. That's Admiral Byrd. And then in the Admiral Byrd's diary, supposedly, the luminous beings are containing. It's just TikTok.
He's not seeing ice anymore. He's seeing like forests and
exactly,
and waterfalls. Yeah.
It makes for great fiction, but it's not true. And some of that is kind of this continuation of that Nazi mysticism idea. So, but that's where it goes, right? There are some very interesting connections that Peter Levenda points to in his book series between individuals involved in the occult and certain individuals involved in things like Scientology and the Process Church, and how those things maybe continued some of these ideas as well. I think those are worth looking into. But that's the occult. But probably the bigger thing that I would say maybe really affects us today is how the Nazis use propaganda and the occult in terms of programming societies, right?
Yeah, sure.
So we talked
big difference.
Yeah. We talked about how this can be done through memes, and it is done today through memes. You've seen this done through political parties, right?
Of course.
Sure.
Yeah.
And we're seeing it done by the people who worship those political parties, for lack. I mean, right? Yeah. It really ends up being that. And so they're using those same tactics. They're using those same Jungian archetypes that the Nazis helped perfect. And even brands are doing it today. So I would say some of that part of occultism, that very functional part that may or may not involve supernatural, that part worked its way into today. The government uses that stuff. There was Operation MK-Ultra, where they were expanding on the Nazi mind control programs, where they were experimenting with acid and other ways to control people's minds. That all came out. Operation Midnight Climax, where they were using prostitutes to push acid onto people and then studying the effects and seeing if they could control their minds. This was all happening. Like, it's all documented on Wikipedia, found in history books. It's all real stuff. All of that grew out of the Nazi programs as well. That would be the other thread. I think we have what happened to the Nazi psychic experiments and mind control stuff. They continue, right? That's what we find. We find that they continued into Russia. Russia advanced, and then we find that the U.S. in reaction starts to try to play catch up really fast. The U.S. says that they quit in 1995, but then we know that that's not true. There's people like Lou Elizondo and all sorts of people in the public today saying that they received gateway training and other stuff in the military post Stargate. Then the third thread would be the tech. What happens to the Kammler tech? And all of that ends up, of course, getting wrapped into these special access programs. And at that point, the U.S. is very aware that the UFO phenomenon is very real. They're already looking into it, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's become very clear that this stuff hasn't stopped. When you talk about the occult and you talk about governments using the occult, my only concern is once the Pentecostal snake handlers start to infiltrate the U.S. government, that's when I get worried.
Too late, brother.
Are they there? Oh no.
Well, there's some pretty extreme religious types in Congress right now, and that gets interesting, right? I look forward to talking about this more, and we're going to get into this in the next episode. But when we go into current events, I think we'll talk about what's happening in Congress. We'll talk about especially what's happening with those Nazca mummies and this new Boogosphere. And we'll talk about the Jake Barber stuff, which definitely deserves talking about. And we'll talk about why we haven't been talking about it, which is basically look at how far you got just by listening to these 3 World War II episodes. Look at how far you got in understanding a little bit more about the phenomenon, as opposed to like listening to the latest click tease from the
hype man.
Right?
Yeah,
I think
sure.
I mean, further.
Yeah, I mean, it gives us and our listeners context on what we're talking about.
Right.
For sure. Well, I think that pretty much wraps it up. I mean, we covered so much through this series. And like we said, this provides such a great and important context to what we talk about every episode. So I'm sure it's going to come up again in the future multiple times.
Absolutely. And now we'll have a little background. So when we talk about, hey, how this object today resembles this object from World War II and how that relates, the lore ends up being important only to that extent, right?
Right.
So I look forward to talking about how that's all relevant to today in the next episode. And we'll talk about some of these wild things that have been happening while we've been back in the 40s. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again, Ram, for another great discussion. I look forward to more. To our listeners, check out our website. We're always posting new information. It's 14winds.com. And you can also check us out on TikTok and YouTube.
Yeah, and thanks for all of your wonderful notes and comments and your likes and subscribes and whatnot. It really helps because that's the only way people get to know we're out there. And your notes just drive us and keep us rolling. So thank you so much. And we look forward to the next one.
All right. Take care.
Take care.